This is episode 20, Cassiodorus and Boethius. Both were involved with the Gothic court. So after the Roman Empire fell, who ruled Italy? It was this tribe called the Goths. And two of the people that they used to run stuff were Cassiodorus and Boethius. The two men knew each other, and as you probably saw, Cassiodorus wrote a couple letters to Boethius. Of the two of them, Cassiodorus is kind of a minor guy. He's not really much of a thinker, but he was a great collector of manuscripts, and he saved a lot of Greek and Roman writing. Boethius is much more of a thinker. Boethius is much more of a poet. And of course, Boethius wrote while he was in jail, so he was kind of a tragic figure. So let's go into Cassiodorus. If you guys could go to the first reading of Cassiodorus, where it's called The Monk as Scribe. So remember, there were no printing presses back then. So how were people going to read the Gospels? Somebody had to copy this out, copy by copy by copy. And when you copy out the word of the Lord, Cassiodorus says, "How noble the zeal to fight against the temptations of the devil with pen and ink. Every word of the Lord written by the scribe, a wound inflicted on Satan." So there's a very romanticized view of the scribe's job. He's really fighting the devil with his pen and his ink. And we get a sort of similarly romanticized scribe's point of view in a line which reminds me of the earlier odes, the Greek and Roman odes to man. He talks about how the scribes use a sundial and a water clock, and he says, "The art of man provides these instruments to summon the scribe to his divine task, as if by sounding trumpets." Instead of praising man, though, or his invention so much, what Cassiodorus actually devotes a lot of energy to praising is paper. He writes this little ode in praise of paper, and he says, quite rightly, "Before the discovery of paper, all the sayings of the wise, all the thoughts of the ancients could only perish. Paper which keeps the sweet harvest of the mind and restores it to the reader whenever he chooses to consult it. Paper, faithful witness of human actions, enemy of oblivion." That's the first time we're seeing people praise paper. And then we have another first here, this idea of the toleration of Jews. So who can tell me why Cassiodorus thought that the Christians should tolerate the Jews and not harm the Jews? He says, "We cannot command a religion because we cannot force anyone to believe against his will." In other words, even if they're wrong, we can't punish them, because you can't force someone to believe against his will. Then he makes a second point, which is about the rule of law, that the Jews are a people of law and deserve respect because of that. So Cassiodorus says, "Civilization means observance of law. This makes life in communities possible, and we greatly desire to keep in force the laws of the ancients." So he means especially the Jews, who have their own laws. But while calling for the two communities to respect each other, the Jews and the Christians, Cassiodorus also says that they should keep apart because their faiths differ. And here we're seeing the idea that the Jews should be separate from the Christians and have their own kind of separate life in their own neighborhoods with their own police and everything else, their own stores. Okay. Another thing I notice in Cassiodorus, what does he think of cities? He says here, "We call cities the chief ornament of human society. Let the wild beasts live in fields and woods. Men ought to draw together in cities. The man who shuns society becomes at once an object of suspicion." And again, this reminds me of the Cyclops who live apart. And Aristotle, in fact, says that people who aren't political animals are regarded with suspicion, and he actually compares them to the Cyclops living by their own law. But the cities have kind of fallen apart. So Cassiodorus says, hopefully, "Let the cities then return to their old splendor. Let none prefer the charms of the country to the walls reared by the men of old." And then he has this kind of lyrical passage about what it's like to stroll through Rome. He says, "To stroll through the forum, to look in at some skillful craftsman at his work, to push one's own cause through the law courts, and then to play games, go to the baths with one's friends, enjoy a banquet. These things a Roman noble truly does." You can tell he kind of misses that old life, the way it used to be before things got so bad in the Dark Ages. Now let's move on to Boethius, the Consolations of Philosophy, which was a beloved work for a long time in medieval and Renaissance Europe. It was one of the main ways in which classical Greek and Roman philosophy came to Christians who really didn't have access to these books. But they had access to Boethius's book, which was copied out and became quite popular. I guess it was sort of the medieval equivalent of a bestseller. And he wrote it when he was in prison, and he was eventually put to death because the Gothic king suspected him of treason, and the evidence is ambiguous as to whether Boethius actually did anything. But he starts out under the section headlined, The Misery of Banishment. He describes a lot of the thoughts in his mind. So we know he's in prison, first of all. So that's something we bring to the setting. And twice in this first section, he quotes Homer. So we can see how clearly he's a person of some Greek learning. And although he himself is not a monk, he is certainly a man of letters, and he is certainly living alone, and he has a lot of time to think. And one of the things that I noticed is that he actually talks about missing the library of his house. He says, "O philosophy, I miss the library of my house, where you so often used to sit with me, when I used to probe the secrets of nature with you. There you commended Plato's opinion that philosophers should keep the reins of government from wicked men." So he's talking about how he remembers reading Plato's Republic in his library. And then he sort of laments the life he used to have and the path his life has gone on. He says, "Storms of life, behold the man who once lived free. This man who sought out the source. From shining east to watery west, he sought the reason why. Now see that mind which searched and found nature's hidden secrets, lying prostrate, a prisoner of night." So he feels that he used to be a proud, free-thinking man, and now he's this miserable prisoner. And so now that he doesn't have all the good fortune he used to have, he's thinking about just everything in his life. And he goes into this very interesting treatment of fortune, which becomes probably the most important thing to remember about Boethius, his idea of fortune, and what symbol or metaphor does he use for fortune? The Wheel of Fortune. And this becomes very famous, and in fact, when you read Shakespeare, you will see this idea of the Wheel of Fortune takes you up, and then it takes you down, and then it takes you around, and so medieval people and Renaissance people are fascinated by this idea of what comes around goes around on the Wheel of Fortune. And he says at first he thought that fortune favored him and then didn't favor him. And he felt very betrayed by fortune, this kind of goddess of change. But then he says, "Now I see that change is her normal behavior, expressing fortune's true nature. In the act of changing, she has preserved her own particular kind of constancy toward me. I have discovered the changing faces of the random goddess." By casting him down, fortune is just acting according to her nature, which is to change things. "If I try to stop fortune's wheel from turning, I show myself the most foolish of men, for once the wheel of fortune begins to stop, it would no longer be the wheel of fortune. Therefore, the wheel of fortune will turn forever." So he realizes, as he says, that change is what fortune does. Boethius says, "O fortune, you never cease to play that game as you turn your wheel in its ever-changing circle, filled with joy as you bring the top to the bottom and the bottom to the top. Yes, I can rise up on your wheel, but I can't count it an injury when by the same token I begin to fall, as the rules of the game require." And that actually brings to mind Jesus' statement that when you live by the sword, you have to be ready to die by the sword. When you play a game, you have to play by the rules of that game. And Boethius says a similar thing: "If I commit my boat to the winds, I must sail whichever way they blow, not just where I want. A farmer who entrusts his seed to the fields must balance the bad years against the good." In other words, if you're going to ride that Wheel of Fortune, you'll have to see how it balances out. Sometimes you're on the top, sometimes you're on the bottom. Then this fascinating idea that bad fortune or bad luck can actually be more helpful than good fortune or good luck, especially from the point of view of the philosopher or the person seeking truth or wisdom. He says, "Bad fortune, I think, can prove more useful to us than good fortune. Good fortune always seems to bring happiness, but deceives me with her smiles, whereas bad fortune always tells the truth. Good fortune deceives, but bad fortune enlightens." And I think he is saying here, well, I'm in jail, I have nothing, but if life gives you a lemon, make lemonade. At least I'm going to get wisdom from this, and I'm going to write it down, and someday people are going to read it. One of the next sections below that, the next section, the lure of possessions. He goes a little more psychologically into explaining why people seek possessions and wealth. And here there's a note that's new, and I think it's probably coming out of the same well from which St. Augustine drew his insights. And we're going to read Augustine next. Boethius says, "I feel a lack of any blessing of my own inside myself, driving me to seek blessings in things separate and external." So we see here the beginnings of what we now call psychology, where Boethius is analyzing his own motives and those of other people and saying the reason that people do things is not always apparent to them, but there can be a deeper reason, a hunger, perhaps. He has an appetite for some kind of blessing, which he doesn't have in himself. So there's a kind of soul hunger there. And to try to gratify that soul hunger, oftentimes people seek blessings outside themselves to compensate for what they don't have within. And then he goes into this idea that the true goodness is within. Whoever deeply searches out the truth should turn his gaze inward, bring his wandering thoughts in a circle home. For what his heart seeks without him, it holds and treasures within. Just two more sections, and then we'll end for today. On free will. And I think this is very important because free will is really very basic to the Catholic point of view or the Christian point of view, which holds sway for a long time, basically all the way up until the Protestant Reformation. He says under the section, "Free will, I regard my will as free, for without free will no rational nature could exist. Whatever by nature has the use of reason has the power of judgment to decide each matter. It can distinguish by itself between what to avoid and what to desire. But man pursues what he judges desirable and avoids that which he thinks undesirable. So creatures with the power of reason also have the freedom to will or not to will." Much of this is from Aristotle, but Boethius' spin on this is taken up later on by Thomas Aquinas in the 1200s and becomes very influential and is the doctrine of the Catholic Church to this day. And it becomes, I think, also very core to the conservative point of view, the idea that we have free will, the principle of motion is within us, and that we basically choose to do what we want to do, for better or for worse. Finally, this idea that love is its own law. He says, "But who can give a law to love? Love unto love itself makes law. Complaining of the gods above, down to hell I went for love." So this is a very romantic idea, the idea that we saw, I think, first in Ovid, in Pyramus and Thisbe, that love will find a way. This idea of love being almost a force of nature, which it has its own law and is kind of beyond human law to govern, is an idea which will come up again very strongly when we get to the King Arthur legends and the time of chivalry. And with that, I will adjourn everyone, and thank you for your time.